We're pleased to have with us today Father Anthony Cekada, author of Work of Human Hands, a Theological Critique of the Mass of Paul VI, which was published by Philothea Press last year. And we wanted to start talking about the book with Father today by asking, Father, where did you first encounter the new Mass? And tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what the context was for you to encounter it. For people like myself, who grew up after the council, we only ever knew the Novus Ordo growing up, so we didn't have a basis of comparison, but you clearly did. And tell us a little bit about how that informed you.
Well, I was a pre-Vatican II baby boomer, and I was raised in the 50s, went to Catholic school in Milwaukee, the 50s and early 60s. And there I experienced the glories of the pre-Vatican II Church, how strong the Church was, and how respected the Church was, and got a very good formation in the school that I went to in understanding of the Mass. We had a high Mass every day as children. We sang the high Mass, we learned Gregorian chant. I was an altar server, and all of those things brought me really to love and to understand what we would now call the traditional Latin Mass. When I was in 8th grade, I decided that I wanted to go to the minor seminary and to prepare for the priesthood. Just about that time, in approximately 1964, 1965, the changes were starting to be introduced in the liturgy of the Church after the Second Vatican Council. I had a hesitation about them as a child. I remember even in 8th grade, they struck me as a little bit strange and slightly disrespectful, I suppose. I entered the minor seminary and saw all of the different Vatican II changes unfold bit by bit until the new Mass was finally introduced in 1969.
So give us some sense of that time period, Father. Was that around 64 to 69?
It was 1965. Approximately 1965 to 1969. 69 was when I graduated from high school. So progressively, as I was in high school, I was seeing these different changes occur.
So as you're watching this and finally the new Mass gets introduced, when did you first see it? And it's sort of the famous question, do you remember where you were when you first saw Novus Ordo Mass?
Well, I was an organist at St. Rita's Church in Milwaukee from 1969 to 1970. The new Mass came out in 1969 and was introduced in English, translated into English in 1970. And the first time I saw it celebrated was on Palm Sunday in 1970. I was quite surprised by what I saw because growing up in the time I did, I was quite aware of the different liturgical abuses that were being perpetrated. Different group masses, very casual treatment of the Blessed Sacrament, and many of these things that I complained about as abuses that I thought were problems, I saw eventually introduced into the new Mass. For instance, the handshaking, the sign of peace. That all struck me as really quite odd, a very odd thing to do in the middle of your preparation for Holy Communion. Yet this was something that was officially introduced into the new Mass. So there are a number of elements like that.
I just heard on NPR a few weeks ago a story about the new changes. And they were reflecting that oddly enough, some of the old people weren't excited about the changes of changing some of the English Mass's words to "and with your spirit" and that sort of thing. And I'm thinking, as you're talking, there must have been some rumblings in the church you were attending that, there's going to be a change, etc. And there's some parallels in, people saying, I don't want this to change, except maybe back then the old people were saying that they didn't want it to change, and it didn't, and now the old people want to keep it the new English Mass.
There certainly was quite a bit of it. It was very shocking, I suppose, to many people. I mean, if I, as a relatively young person, was shocked by these changes, certainly there are many old people who were as well. Among them were many converts. The reaction that you would get from people like this was, well, I went to a Protestant service before in the vernacular, and now the Mass is becoming Protestantized, and I don't like it. I didn't become a Catholic to see this happen.
I've seen some correspondence from Yves Lenoir on this point to one of the bishops.
In fact, I think the last either letter or entry in his diary that he wrote before he died was about his experience with some of the post-Vatican II liturgical changes.
Yes. Yeah. So here we are again, 40-some years later from your very first experience, and the Mass is changing yet again. Mm-hmm. Reflecting back to what you said about something being fixed, you found it shocking. Did you have any, obviously we see behind that there you have a few books, one or two. Mm-hmm. So this must have started at an early age to do research. One of the things that I think has been very valuable in our correspondence and the times I've gotten to know you is you and Bishop Dolan like the phrase, look it up, mm-hmm. As an actual practice.
Okay.
So where did you start to look it up? Because obviously there weren't any resources on the new Mass in 1970 other than probably a copy of the Missal.
Well, precisely. As regards the copy of the Missal itself, when the new Mass was promulgated, I tried to get a copy right away of the official text, of the official version of it. And it was rather difficult to do because of shipping considerations in those days to get books from abroad. But I managed to get a copy of the Latin Novus Ordo. It was published in about a 300-page book that was called Ordo Missae in Latin. I remember driving all the way across town to pick this thing up when it arrived, figuring that this was really going to give me, the lowdown on what was going on, and that I was sure the Holy Father, really fixed all these terrible liberals by this new Mass that he promulgated. Well, I was quite disappointed, because even the Latin version of it I found quite disappointing.
Do you remember what it was that you found disappointing about it? I mean, we can start going here into all of the changes, but were there one or two things that particularly struck you when the very first time you looked at it?
Well, one of the things was that there are so many options that you were free to do this, that, or the other thing. And I had seen this sort of mentality used at the seminary and in more liberal parishes as a way to introduce false ideas that undercut Catholic doctrine and Catholic teaching. So there's endless options. I talk about it actually in my book a little bit as a deregulated liturgy. And that's one of the major problems of the Novus Ordo. But there was something I noticed right away at the beginning. And then some of the strange Latin in the general instruction, in the rubrics, in the introductory part of the new Mass. How it talked about the Mass, it seemed in different terms from the way that we understood it as a sacrifice. So this was unnerving. Even though I hadn't read any traditionalist literature at that point. But incidentally, very soon thereafter, I read the translation of the Ottaviani intervention, which was published in Triumph magazine in the United States.
And what did you think of that?
Well, I thought that it was on target, that it hit a lot of the points, a lot of the difficulties that I saw with the new Mass. And I was very sympathetic to that, to the objections that made, and to the objections that the different commentators on the Ottaviani intervention made.
Now, Father, you mentioned Triumph magazine. Back in this time, there's no such thing as a traditional Catholic movement. It was just Catholicism, and probably this started to be a holdout movement.
Yes.
So for those who don't know, Triumph magazine, would that have been similar to something like The Wanderer today?
It was a Not quite like The Wanderer. It was a magazine that was issued every month, and it was William Buckley's brother-in-law, Brent Brazell, who wrote it, who was the editor of the magazine. And it had a number of very good articles every month that spoke about some of the difficulties with the doctrinal difficulties with the post-Vatican II changes. It had a very high level of writing, as I recall, in it.
So this would have been the beginning of, you could argue, the conservative Novus Ordo time, since there wasn't a traditional Catholic movement per se at the time. That's where you were, and when you first started to see this change, you probably were in that camp.
Well, yes, I was very sympathetic to it, and there were a number of us at the seminary who were very sympathetic to that, who saw the problems with the liturgical changes.
So, Father, you're obviously coming from a position of knowing what was the right thing, what had always been the tradition, and then seeing something new and being confused. For those of us who never had the traditional Mass, you always have an aha moment. We know that the Mass, perhaps there's a vague sense that the new Mass isn't as reverent as it could be, or we see it dressed up with Latin, we think this is really great, but then we get exposed to even a low traditional Mass, and we realize it's a completely different ballgame. You must have been asking yourself, you finished minor seminary, graduated high school, what do I do now, given that these are the new rules, this is the new Mass. Where did you escape to?
Well, first of all, one always hoped that things would get better. And that was my outlook very much in the minor seminary and in the seminary college. You always hope that at some point the situation would turn around. Eventually I ended up in the Cistercian order. The Cistercians were a monastic order. They were an offshoot of the Benedictines. And the Cistercian order of the Common Observance, which I joined, tended to be very, very conservative. They were decentralized, and each monastery, in effect, had its own customary, its own practice and everything. So when the Vatican II changes hit, all of these Cistercian monasteries maintained a great deal of the traditional liturgy. So the monastery that I joined had the entire Benedictine Divine Office chanted in Latin. Now we had the Novus Ordo, but it was all in Latin except for the readings, and we did all of the old Gregorian chants. And so I thought that, well, perhaps this was the wave of the future, perhaps this would be the place for me to go. And so for 2 years I experienced the Novus Ordo in Latin with all sorts of chant in performed in a very ritualized and strict fashion according to the rubrics. What I have to say pushed me over the edge as far as thinking that the Novus Ordo is something I could no longer assist at was the Cistercians sent me to a monastery in Switzerland which had similar liturgical practices. The idea was that I would study there, learn French, and go to the university to study theology. Well, one of the things that I discovered when I got there is that here in the midst of this, all of this ritual, beautiful ritual and beautiful chant, they had communion in the hand. So you would do all of these Latin chants, and then most of the monks would receive communion in the hand, which struck me as extremely disrespectful. It was at that time that was about 1975, that the traditionalist movement and Archbishop Lefebvre had a lot of publicity and a lot of controversy going on about them in Europe. And it's at that point that I decided I would side with them and reject the new Mass.
So, where did we go from there, Father? Did you go to Icone?
Yes, went to Icone in 1975. I was ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre in 1977. then came back to the United States.
Sent you back here.
Back to the United States, yes.
And you were assigned to Armada, Michigan, is that right?
That's correct.
In
yes.
1977, and you were there at, I guess it was a proto-seminary, or it was a seminary, it's a house of studies.
Yes, St. Joseph's.
And you were hoping to teach a course in liturgy, but again, going back to what we had said earlier, there wasn't necessarily the textbook.
Yes. The then Father Sanborn said, well, since you had a monastic background, you're perfect for teaching liturgy, so teach a course in liturgy. I looked for different textbooks to use. I couldn't find ones that really seemed to me to be free from the modernism, or at least inclinations in that particular direction, and that was something I found rather surprising. That in researching the material for this course, many pre-Vatican II texts contained in seed or in principle, the ideas for the Novus Ordo.
And that's where this book began.
Yes. Also, I wanted to give my seminarians some sort of a overview or general conspectus of the difficulties with the liturgical reform. Obviously, they're in a traditionalist seminary, and they should have some sort of a global view of what the difficulties are with the post-Vatican II liturgical reform. I really couldn't find a book to use that I thought did this adequately. There were shorter treatises that I looked at, but I really couldn't find something that spoke to all of the difficulties that I saw in the Mass of Paul VI.
And you mentioned there were some other titles. They weren't all out in 1977, but we have The Great Sacrilege, Patrick Henry Olmore's books, Pope Paul's New Mass. And I think Pope Paul's New Mass is probably what most consider, I think prior to your book's release, most people would have considered it sort of the definitive book within their own scope on the New Mass. And for those who have that as their context, how would you differentiate your book from what Michael Davies did?
Well, first of all, Davies had a lot of very interesting stuff and made a number of interesting points and revealed certain things about the New Mass that certainly needed to be said. And you have to say, too, that his series, by setting the historical context in terms of the Protestant revolt in England and then Vatican II, and then finishing the series with the New Mass, all of that was extremely helpful for providing a context. What I felt, though, that Davies didn't do adequately was to discuss the influence of modernism and modernist theology on the New Rite. That was one point. The other point is that Davies tended to talk more specifically about the problems with the ordinary of the Mass, those parts of the Mass that remain the same basically from Sunday to Sunday and feast to feast. He didn't have all that much on the propers of the Mass, and I started to see difficulties with the propers of the Mass as well. So there are a number of areas I felt that he really didn't cover. Also, I found his conclusion to be very weak. He didn't really make a forceful conclusion to the book at all. He basically said that, well, the Mass of Paul VI is an essay in ambiguity. Well, of course it is, but I mean, it's more than that, and it's worse than that, because we can see its effects on the faith of Catholics throughout the world.
I was going to say it's 400 pages to get to that. It might be.
Oh, I think it's 600 pages to get to that. So,
well, Father, let's circle back to the point you just made about modernism, because as many who I think will come to your book for the first time, I was surprised to find out when I first read your book a couple years ago, when it was in draft form, that this went all the way back. And it started, you could say it started innocently. I don't think it's fair to put this on Dom Guéranger, But the liturgical movement as we know it, and all of those connotations that go with that phrase, actually started with good intentions.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, in the by the early 19th century, spirituality generally in the Catholic Church had shifted away from the sacred liturgy. And because of the different upheavals in Europe, the different social upheavals, the wars, the revolutions, etc., the sacred liturgy was not really being performed in many places as solemnly as it should be. In France, there was the great figure of Dom Prosper Guéranger, who was a monk of Salem, or rather who was the founder of Salem, and he refounded the Benedictine order in France after the Revolution. And he made one of the elements of his congregation's apostolate to be the correct performance of the sacred liturgy. So he stirred up a lot of interest in research into the history of the sacred liturgy and in performing the sacred liturgy correctly and in understanding its spiritual depth. So this spread as a result of the work of Dom Guéranger, and he was the great figure certainly from that century, and it bore much excellent fruit in the restoration of liturgical texts, in the restoration certainly of Gregorian chant, in the interest that many Catholics started to take in performing the sacred liturgy correctly and solemnly. So that's the inheritance that Dom Guéranger gave to the Church. And of course this blossomed at the time of Pope St. Pius X, who promoted a reform in church music and in Gregorian chant. And in his pontificate, he accomplished much for the restoration of the sacred liturgy as well. So the liturgical movement that Guéranger began had many beautiful fruits and many that really raised the consciousness of Catholics everywhere about the importance of the liturgy and liturgical spirituality.
So how did this go wrong?
Well,
and can we just blame it on the French?
Oh no, please, not on the first order of the Church. You had at the beginning of the 20th century, of course, modernism and the phenomenon of modernism, which was so forcefully condemned by Pope St. Pius X. One of my theories is that the modernists had a special attraction for liturgy, and after the condemnation of modernism by Pope St. Pius X, many of the people who had modernist inclinations went into the field of sacred liturgy. And well, why would they do that? Well, liturgy was considered sort of a safe discipline. The common conception of liturgy, despite the work of the liturgical movement, was liturgy was basically rubrics. So if someone of modernist inclination went in and tried to apply his modernist principles to, let us say, historical research or to the handling of liturgical texts, he wouldn't necessarily be caught out. Another aspect of that might be this, that the modernists are inclined to reduce religion to sentiment and to feeling. And because there are so many aspects of the sacred liturgy that appeal to sense and sentiment, that naturally that would be a field that would interest them. So there are a number of explanations like that. One of the most prominent liturgical figures from that era was Edmund Bishop. And he wrote a number of essays that were very, very highly regarded among people in the liturgical movement. And it turns out in his diaries, later in his correspondence, which was published about 40 years later, he talked about, in fact, how sympathetic he was to modernism and how much he identified himself, in fact, as a modernist.
Well, and in the chapter that you talk about this, there's a whole host of characters
Yes.
that come out, and I think a lot of times those, I often say that, sometimes Americans will say, yes, well, it's all the Masons' fault that this all happened. They're looking for a boogeyman. So a lot of people say, well, Bugnini, that was when Lenin came across in the train car. But really, Bugnini had a lot of people that came before him. And there's so many, we really don't have time to talk about all of them, but I thought we might talk about at least Bouillet and a little person, a little at the time, little known cardinal named Montini.
Okay.
So how do we get from Dom Guéranger to Louis Bouillet?
Good question. Bouillet is a little bit later in the liturgical movement. He kind of came into his own in the late 40s and early 50s. But he was part of the European liturgical movement. He was a convert from Protestantism, from Lutheranism. That was his background. He was an Oratorian priest. He had there's a series of lectures that he gave at Notre Dame in the 1950s that were put together in the book Liturgical Piety. And the theories on the sacred liturgy and the theories on the Mass that he enunciates in that book, he bases on the teaching of Inga Brilliot, who was a Swedish Lutheran ecumenist in the 1930s. And he was kind of a high church Lutheran, I guess. And these different ideas about the Eucharist. And Bouillet praises the ideas very much of Brilliot and takes them up as his own. The notion of the Mass as something that is primarily an assembly, or the need to de-emphasize the consecration of the Mass. And there are many ideas that he picks up from Brilliot, and he also criticizes very bitterly, Bouillet does, just about every period, preceding period in the sacred liturgy. He condemns the medieval period. He condemns the Baroque period. He condemns Dom Guéranger, in fact, theoretically his predecessor in the movement. He does have a lot of praise for the High Church Caroline divines in England, Protestants saying that, after Archbishop Laud, saying that, well, they really in many respects developed the correct understanding, the correct idea of what true Christian liturgy should be.